can something that God created, that comes straight from the earth, be evil? How can it be bad? Weed is not bad. Anyway, it makes me realize things that I never realized before. It helps me get closer to God. So this is episode 1 of The Way That Seems Right to a Man, and it's based off Proverbs 14:12, which says, "There's a way that seems right to a man, but it leads to death." And I want to talk about this, and before we get into it, just to give you some background, a large part of my life I was smoking weed. I used to, in my teenage years up to adulthood, there was more days that I smoked than I didn't. Sorry, parents. But it's true, and we got to be honest, right? And especially when people are thinking like this, like how I was saying at the start of the video, that's how I used to think before I knew Jesus. This is how I used to think, and it seems logical and it seems correct, that how can something that comes from the earth that God created be evil? And I took that and I applied it to lots of different things. To give you a brief part of my testimony, I was seeking a truth, and actually got to the point where I was seeking Jesus, and I wanted to know who Jesus was. And one of the ways which I did that was through drugs. I used to be a big advocate of drugs. I used to be a big advocate of taking drugs to find yourself, to find truth. I was really into that, and I would never in a million years imagine that I would say anything against it. However, things changed when I met Christ, when I received an understanding of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. So this is what I want to talk about today. This is the biblical answer to that question, because I know that also many Christians struggle with this. So just to briefly go into my testimony, I used this very thought process to justify taking different kinds of drugs. For example, you may not have heard of it, but there's something called ayahuasca, which they make from a root in the Amazon and a bark. So my thinking was like, it's just nature. How could it possibly be evil, or how can it not be truth? Was my thinking. How can it not be truth if it's just natural? And so I took ayahuasca in the Amazon back in, that would be like 2013 or something. And I could tell you more about that another time, but one thing's for certain, you don't need to do that. And I also, more recently, that when I was seeking about Jesus, I took something called Abigail, which is similar to ayahuasca in the fact that it's a psychotropic plant that puts you into a state where you can communicate with the spiritual realm. You're still conscious, you're still able to write things down, but you're able to communicate with what people would term as God or the universe. You can ask anything. So I've been in that belief that these things are good and they're there to serve us. But that was before I had an understanding of the gospel. So that's what I want to share today, is why, as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, I do not believe those things are good. I don't believe that you should do it if you're seeking God, especially if you're a Christian. So here's the answer to that question. How can it possibly be bad if God created it, if God put it on the earth, if it's natural, if it only comes from nature, then it must be the truth. That was my exact line of thinking. However, that was without the gospel in context. Here is it. Here is the answer to that question in the context of the gospel. God created a perfect earth. God's creation was perfect. There was no sin. There was no death. There was no disease. There was no good and evil. It was God's reality. God's reality. We were only aware of Him and His goodness. However, part of that creation, part of that perfect creation was free will. Because without free will, there can be no love. There can be no real love. Love is a choice. There must be free will. The existence of real love demands the coexistence of free will. And in that free will, we disobeyed a command from our Creator. And this is what, in a really short, compacted version, this is what brought about sin. And the Bible says that the whole of creation became under the influence of sin. So even nature was corrupted by the power of sin, by that choice that humans made. So this is if you're asking, if you're willing to consider the Christian perspective, or if you are a Christian and asking this same question, how can such a thing be bad? How can something that comes from a plant be can lead to sin, or can create a barrier between you and God? Well, one thing is, Jesus said He is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through Him. So if you're trying all these different means to get to God, which ultimately everyone's trying to do, whether they call it, they're trying to find the truth, or they're trying to find fulfillment or peace or enlightenment, they're trying to come to God's reality. That's what I believe. You don't need anything but Jesus to reach God. Everything necessary to reach God is in Jesus. You don't need ayahuasca, you don't need Abigail, you don't need weed, you don't need any of these things. If you put your trust in God, He will lead you into the presence. So that's episode 1. How can we be bad? Because it's under the influence of, like everything else in this creation, it's under the influence of sin. And it's groaning for the manifestation of the sons of God to be revealed. If you're a Christian, that's us. So let's do it. God bless you. Speak to you soon. Bye bye.